Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Unicus Radio Hour. I'm your host, Robert Stanley. It's a pleasure to be with you at a different time today. Actually broadcasting during the daytime. Thought we'd try something a little different, see how that goes. And, a lot of people have been asking me about the mysterious Dr. J, clinical psychologist that contacted me regarding the information I've been putting out about archons or demons, I guess some people call them. So, we're fortunate that Dr. J is actually granting us an interview. This is really, he's putting himself out on a limb to do this, so I do appreciate that very much. And here's a little bit about him. He graduated on the Dean's List from a major university on the East Coast with a B.A. in psychology and a minor in criminology. He's earned a master's degree in counseling from a different major university, again on the East Coast. He was both a research assistant and a teaching assistant while in an APA-approved PhD counseling psychology program. He has over 35 years of frontline clinical experience in working with people who hear voices and see more of them in a few. He has seen more of a few of them in a few days than most people would see of these people in a lifetime. I think typically we're going to call them schizophrenic, although that's just a clinical term. Really doesn't mean a whole lot. Dr. J has worked on the front lines of one of the largest state psychiatric hospitals in the world for 7 years. He's worked on one of the largest mental health centers in a particular state here in the United States for 2 years. He spent 16 years working in the psychology department of a large state prison, learning about how, quote unquote, the voices worked and dealing with the criminally insane for 16 years. He's currently a licensed clinical therapist and has worked in the emergency rooms of large cities and county hospitals doing psychiatric crisis work for over 8 years. He's won an Instructor of the Year award for teaching abnormal psychology at a large community college. He's been awarded the State Meritorious Service Award for Psychology and Substance Abuse programs developed for the Department of Corrections and has been hired as a consultant to institute the same programs in other states. He has a commercial pilot's license. He has he's been a certified scuba diver for over 40 years, which has included hundreds of dives. Those are always interesting to do. He is currently working closely with a team of psychiatrists in a large private hospital emergency room, screening and evaluating psychiatric patients that come into the ER. And he says here he's worked in close conjunction with psychiatrists his entire career, and he hasn't been locked up yet, so he must not be crazy. Okay, so just joking. He is obviously quite sane, and I have talked to him, and he's been kind enough to share a lot of his personal insights with me. Dr. J, welcome to the program.
Well, great to be here, Robert. I just want to make it clear that, I have no ulterior motive for doing this broadcast other than to get the truth out to people. I've got no book to sell. I've got no website to promote. I'm not getting any monetary gain whatsoever, and I have a fair amount to lose because neither psychiatry nor the big drug companies are going to like what I have to say.
Okay.
So I'm taking this risk for those of you who are out there who are able to comprehend what I'm going to tell you, which in some cases is stranger than fiction.
Well, I agree. And as I said before, if you can speak up, if there's any way you can raise your volume, because I cannot raise your volume anymore on my side, just speak a little louder, okay? Just pretend you're yelling at me.
Let me see if I can. Okay, that's about as high as I can go. I guess I'm going to have to speak up. My voice is naturally soft.
Yeah, that's okay.
If I drop back, let me know.
Okay. All right. So let's begin at the beginning. How was it that you came to the awareness that that these voices were not some sort of chemical imbalance in the patient's brain?
Well, let me start from the very beginning because
Okay.
My very strong mistrust of authority is overriding all of this. I mean, it started with my father that I couldn't trust. I had a scoutmaster who promised I would get the star rank if I did certain things, and I completed those things, and he said, no, that's not enough. Okay, so, and then, it just moved on to the government with, Vietnam lying about winning the war, 50,000 Americans being killed for nothing,
Right.
Nixon lying about Watergate, on and on and on. So, a strong mistrust of authority figures, period. I mean, it's ingrained. When I got into college, I was immediately attracted to abnormal psychology. I mean, I just had a fascination with it. And all through my undergraduate years, here we're reading about all these clinical populations and these different mental disorders, but there was no actual experience of these populations. You just had to trust what the psychologists and the book writers were saying. And for somebody who has a strong mistrust of authority, that was not easy for me.
Okay, so what is abnormal psychology? What does that mean?
Well, it's mental disorders, schizophrenia, delusions.
Oh, I see.
Like on the far end of the normal scale.
Gotcha.
Mental illnesses.
Okay. Okay.
So, I had my suspicions, and as I was going through undergraduate school, here comes a professor and says, well, if two delusional patients ran into each other with the same delusion, one would have to give way. I'm going, well, why would that have to happen? They're both crazy. Why would one have to give way to the other? What kind of rationale is behind that? It stuck in my mind, and I just couldn't get rid of it.
Yeah.
So I couldn't prove it either, so I logged it in there. Not having access to clinical populations to see for myself really bothered me. And then another time, another professor came up and said, well, schizophrenics are much too disorganized to carry out any kind of advanced planning. And that just didn't sit right either. It just didn't make sense. So logged that one in. So after I finished my master's degree, I finished a BA in psychology, finished my master's degree in counseling. I was hired on at one of the largest state hospitals in the entire world. I mean, it was immense. And now I had access to clinical populations. I could actually see for myself. And when I first got in there, I mean, it was just a whole world of abnormal deviance. I remember sitting in the cafeteria one day of the hospital cafeteria. I mean, the place was so big, it was like a city unto itself. There was like, just a couple of years before I got there, there were like 23,000 mental patients in this place.
Wow.
And I remember, it was huge. I remember sitting in the cafeteria and here one of the conversations were about a psychiatric patient, a schizophrenic, who cut his penis off.
Oh, my God.
And the talk of the cafeteria was, they sewed it back on, and it was like, oh, is it taking? Everybody was interested. Is it going to stay on there?
Yeah.
And my question was, why did he do it? Now this didn't happen on one of my units. It happened on a unit of a friend of mine who was also working there with a master's level degree. And I asked him, I said, go ask that guy why he cut his penis off. So he comes back the next day. I always wanted to know why. He comes back the next day and he goes, he told me. So what did he say? Well, he told me he didn't need it anymore.
Whoa.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah, right.
There was this, for me, it was a fascinating place. The building for the criminally insane, it was up on a hill. Nobody knew anybody who worked there, and very little came out of there. And it was the only building that we couldn't get into. I could get into every other building at the state hospital but that one. So that one held a particular fascination for me, and I listened for any news that came out of that place.
Hang on. Did you think they were doing any human experiments there?
I believe they were. In the older days, they were doing a lot, and they even it was even written about.
Really?
Yeah, they were. They were sterilizing people. There's a history of them experimenting with mental patients. At the time I got there, I didn't see any of it, but I know there was a long history of it.
Yeah, because the other day I was accidentally came across it was in the middle of a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where he was playing a marshal and he was investigating a murder on this island, and it was a mental state hospital, and the nurse was now being indicted for murder, but once he finds her, she's like, I didn't do it. They're framing me because they I know what they're doing, and it's not good. They're doing human experimentation. And, oh, my God, it made my skin crawl, actually, watching that.
Well, you see similar things. I mean, people who were report crimes. What do they call these guys?
Whistleblowers?
Yeah, whistleblowers, that's it.
Yeah.
Where they're railroaded into mental hospitals, and they get psychiatrists and psychologists to say they're crazy.
You've seen that?
Oh, yeah. Matter of fact, Sherry, I told you about, her husband is one of those people. Where he was a whistleblower for, he was on the state police, and he saw some stuff going on, and they had him locked up. So he died in prison.
Wait a minute. Who? You mean whoever he was working for?
Yeah, the authorities. So he was with the state police. The authorities above him.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he ended up in prison. She could not get him out, no matter what she did. I mean, they wouldn't review the evidence. They wouldn't take any further documentation. She had proof that the blood type was different, and they just would not listen to it. They just shut it all out. They would not reopen the case. So yeah, I mean, I just saw an article where one guy was committed to a mental hospital because he was a whistleblower. So
really, still in this day and age.
Oh yeah.
Good Lord.
The psychiatrists, they're like the priests, the psychologists and psychiatrists, and it's like, okay, they are the purveyors of what's sanity, what's not sanity, and I mean they can bend things to their way of thinking.
For whatever reason, yeah. For
whatever reason.
Okay, I am sufficiently scared now, and
So the back in the building for the criminally insane, the stuff that came out of there was a pilot, a commercial airline pilot, who ended up in there. This is one of the few stories that broke out of that place. He killed his wife because he believed his wife was turning his son into a homosexual. And this man was flying hundreds of people in commercial jets.
Okay.
And then there was they didn't have the highest quality psychiatrists there. I remember the first time I saw an ECT, electroconvulsive therapy that they were doing on an old thin woman that was extremely depressed. And I'd never seen anything like this before. And she was laying there, and they put in this giant horse needle. I mean, it was big, with some kind of white fluid. They stuck it in her vein, and then they didn't just inject it. They sucked it in and out, so blood mixed with whatever this stuff was.
Oh, God.
And it was a muscle relaxer, and it was huge. And I asked, there was a Cuban psychiatrist, and I said, well, what are you doing that for? And he goes, well, we have to relax the muscles because when she gets the shock, she could break her bones.
Oh, Jesus.
And I'm standing there watching this, and like, I got a little woozy watching the blood come in and out of the needle.
Yeah.
Then they put these paddles on the side of her head and strapped her down. I mean, they just strapped her legs down, strapped her body down, strapped her arms down. I mean, she was in there tight. And here's this guy with this machine. He turns it on, flips the switch, and boom. I mean, she is just convulsing all over the place. And when he turns it off, he's talking to us. He's not looking at her. He's talking to us, and I'm looking at her, and she's turning cyanotic. I mean, she's turning blue on the table. And I'm like, God, she's dying. She's dead. And finally, as an afterthought, he looks down at her, and he goes, oh, and he shocks her and brings her back to life.
What?
And she was dead, and he shocked her. He did the panel thing, and she came back, and I'm like, oh my God.
Okay.
And I'm watching all this, and I go to walk out, and I almost fainted. I had to. The only time in my life I almost fainted, but I had to grab the column until it was so woozy. it was a whole different world there. It was a whole different culture.
Yeah.
Alcoholics. There was one guy in the unit I worked with who was so thirsty for alcohol he drank varnish.
Oops.
And he died. They'd spray hairspray down their throats.
Oh, my
They'd
God.
drink Listerine. And there was always suicides. I remember one guy walked onto the unit one day, and this guy had slit his wrists at 4 a.m, and there was blood all over the ceiling. I mean, so the blood pressure was so high, the blood from his wrist squirted up onto the ceiling and all over the walls and on the floor. And he just kept quiet the whole time. That's how bad he wanted to die.
Wow. Okay.
So, I mean, it was like, whoa, it was a very different kind of place. I mean, it was interesting, but it was like, wow. I mean, this is the far edge of society.
Yeah, clearly.
So one day, remember the delusional thing they said when I was an undergraduate? If two mental patients met each other, one of them would have to give way.
Right.
One day I'm making my clinical rounds on the psychiatric unit, and I see a new patient that I hadn't met before, and he's just wandering around kind of peacefully. And it was my job to kind of keep an eye on who was what and who was off their meds and who was dangerous and who was new, and it's kind of the watchdog for the psychiatrist. So I walked up to this guy and I go, "Hey man, who are you?" And he looks me straight in the eyes and he goes, "I'm Jesus Christ." And I go, "Okay, this is my chance." And I go, no, you can't be Jesus Christ because I am. And he looks at me like stunned, and he thinks for a minute, and I'm going, okay, here's the verdict, it's coming. And he looks at me and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he drives off. So I'm going, all right, so much for trusting the friggin' clinical textbooks.
Yeah.
So what else are they lying to me about,
Yeah.
So, about a year later, here comes an opportunity to check out another one. And this one was like the schizophrenics can't plan anything. They're too disorganized. And this one happened while I was in the PhD program. It's like, well, what? So on another unit where my friend worked, there was a psychiatrist. Like I said, at the state hospital here, they didn't have the highest quality state psychiatrist. This psychiatrist, a thin guy, he dressed, acted, and looked like Dr. Freud. He smoked a pipe like Freud. He had a beard like Freud. I think he fancied himself to be Freud. Everybody thought he was kind of weird.
Yeah.
But he had one schizophrenic guy. I mean, he didn't like him very much, and that's one thing I noticed later was that the psychiatric patients didn't like psychiatrists. They assaulted them at a much higher rate than anybody else. But this one was kind of funny, the planning thing. So here's this psychiatric patient who had it in for Dr. Freud there.
Right.
And he lived up on the 4th floor of this psychiatric unit. Dr. Freud's office was down on the 1st floor. So each floor was manned by an attendant station where there was an attendant who was there or in that area. About 3 a.m. one night, this psychiatric patient snuck down 3 or 4 flights of stairs, past all the attendants, didn't get any attention. I mean, he made it past all of them. He went down to the 1st floor. He somehow broke into Dr. Freud's office there. He climbed up, closed the door, climbed up onto the middle of his desk, pulled down his pants, and took a crap right in the middle of his desk, shaped it into a pipe, and then escaped from the hospital. They never saw him again.
Oh, my God.
So
straight out of one.
Here you go. Here's the, the professor saying, oh, no, schizophrenics can't plan anything. I mean, that was artfully planned and executed, and they never caught the guy.
Yeah.
So here's my suspicion about what these people are telling me, and me having to trust it, in the dumps. And again, I'm going, okay, so, they're telling me this crap. What else are they making up or just saying is, I didn't know.
Right.
So but my suspicions were heightened, greatly heightened. My first encounter with schizophrenics was I didn't like them. I mean, they were crazy.
Yeah.
I only read about them. Once I got to meet them, I couldn't understand them. I mean, I didn't like them. I didn't understand them. I couldn't help them. I didn't know what to do with them, and neither did anybody else. the only thing they knew to do with them was drug them. And, I tried to understand them, and there was this incomprehensible self-destruction in them. I mean, they would go for a little while, and then they would start self-destructing. I mean, it was, I couldn't understand it. It made no sense. I remember one guy, I mean, he was an incredible artist and painter. He painted this beautiful scene of a water mill and a lake, and I mean, it was just gorgeous. And I looked at it, and the next day I went back to his room to talk to him, and he had painted swastikas all over the thing.
Oh.
And these weird sayings, he completely destroyed the picture.
Okay.
The other thing that didn't make any sense is, and I was really disappointed. I was looking forward to, saving the world, a bright, bushy, bright-eyed, going, I'm going to change things. And I found myself being a glorified nursemaid for schizophrenics who weren't taking their medicines.
Yeah.
They were not taking their medicines at an unprecedented rate. I mean, how'd
you find that out? Did they tell you?
No, they don't have to tell me. They just start falling apart.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
You're walking down the hall, and then all of a sudden they start, talking to somebody or doing weird stuff. Or,
yeah, okay.
They weren't going to, that's the last thing they were going to do was tell me they weren't taking their medicines.
Okay.
Because at that point, the only thing I knew to do was turn them back into psychiatry and say, okay, he's not taking them, now you need to inject him.
Oh, Jesus.
And they don't want that happening.
Right.
So no, they weren't about to tell me anything like that.
But you could tell.
Oh yeah, once they started coming unglued, you get a call from one of the vocational instructors. This lady's in the corner, talking to people. She's paranoid. She's seeing demons. She's throwing things. She's throwing fits. She's, I mean, once they start decompensating, it's something. Something's bad wrong. It doesn't take a professional to know that.
All right.
So yeah, and then you go and are you taking your medicines? No.
Mm.
Well, I mean, and this happened at an unprecedented level. The only other psychiatric disorder where the patients weren't taking their medications with such a high frequency was the bipolars, and they got manic, and they love that mania, and that's understandable. They have a lot of energy. They can get a lot of things done. They feel like Superman. I mean, that's an enjoyable experience until they crash.
Okay.
Yeah. So I could understand why they weren't taking their medications, but
right.
The schizophrenics would decompensate into a hellish psychosis. I mean, it was. It was awful. I mean, they'd hear voices, they'd see demons, they'd have nightmares, they were paranoid, they tried to kill themselves.
Wow.
It was just pure hell,
Yeah.
And, you'd ask them, well, why aren't you taking your medications? And the first thing first I asked the psychiatrists, psychologists, and psych nurses, why aren't they taking their meds? And they said, well, that's a symptom of the disease. I mean, that's just a symptom. That's the way it is. It's like, yeah, they weren't curious at all. I mean, it's like they just don't do it. That's why. They don't like the symptom. They don't like the side effects. Yeah, okay. But then when you compared the symptoms of the disease to the side effects, I mean, geez.
Yeah.
You got common side effects of dry mouth, blurred vision, for a while until that straightens out, lethargy, sedation, sexual dysfunction, that kind of stuff. If they take it long enough, then they get some permanent neurological damage called extrapyramidal syndrome, which, I mean, that stays and it's a shake kind of thing.
Mm.
But then you compare it to, you compare those symptoms to psychosis, which is they're seeing demons, they can't sleep, there's paranoia, they're depressed, they're hearing voices, they can't function, there's a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
Things are chasing them, ideas of reference where they think people are talking about them, depression, seeing shadow people, suicidal. I mean, there's no comparison. If you rationally look at which one is worst, the decompensation and the psychosis is worst. And if you ask them, what's worst, they'll tell you, well, the psychosis is worst. And then I ask them, why aren't you taking your medications then?
Yeah.
It didn't make any sense. It just made no sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
The medication side effects were not anywhere near as bad or as hellish as the psychosis. But the only thing I could get out of them for maybe a year and a half was the side effects. The side effects didn't make any sense. The side effects from the meds were not anywhere near as bad as the psychosis was.
Right.
One day I got called up to an office where there was a schizophrenic girl, and her mother was up there, and they wanted me to come up there and talk to both of them. And she was not taking her medications. And her mother was there with us, and I asked her, I said, why aren't you taking your medications? I'd ask them all that, because it just didn't make any sense. And then this one, all of a sudden, she says, because the voices told me not to. And that's the first time I had heard that, but I logged it in. It's like, that's interesting. So I wouldn't just go on what one patient said. I began asking other schizophrenics, do the voices ever tell you anything about your medicines? What do they say about your medicines? Mm-hmm. One after another, it was a positive hit. The voices were clearly telling them not to take their medications. That the psychiatrists were trying to poison them, the psychiatrists were trying to kill them, that the medications were ruining their nerves, and the voices would actually point to the side effects and say, look at you, these are side effects of you dying. I mean, they're poisoning you. And, what is going on here? And I began asking them, are the voices telling me anything else? Uh-huh. The content of the voices was consistently negative, consistently self-destructive messages, isolation that would cause them severe problems. And I'm going, well, what kind of disease would tell the patient not to take the medication that alleviates the symptoms of the disease? I mean, you don't have diabetics. The diabetes doesn't tell the patient not to take the insulin. I mean, what other disease is there on earth that tells the patient not to take the medicines that cure the disease or assist in helping the disease? That made no sense to me. Right. And I interviewed. I mean, I worked with scores and scores of psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychiatric nurses, and they insisted. I mean, there was no doubt in their mind that the voices were hallucinations. It was a symptom of the disease. There's nothing else. And they weren't even curious about it. I mean, they cut it off at that point. Yeah. They are hallucinations. That's all there is. Don't ask any more. That's the way. That's what I was taught. That's what everybody believes. That's the way it is. Sure. So I'm going, well, okay, if they're hallucinations, why are they 99% negative? Why aren't they like other hallucinations? Why aren't some of them positive, some of them negative, some of them neutral, and some of them just pure nonsense? I mean, that's how hallucinations work. Yeah. They don't have any guidelines. They're just all over the place. They're as individual as the person. But not these things. These things were consistently negative. They told the patient to do destructive things, not to take their medicines, to cut their wrists, to kill themselves, to attack other people, to destroy things, to stay away from people. It was consistently negative. Mm. So there was a consistent negative self-direction, and it wasn't random. And that self-direction was always pointing the patient towards self-destruction. And this was true over space and time, over years, over different psychiatric units, and later over states and different institutions across the United States. It was all the same. It was all negative. It just wasn't all over the place. So, what it reminds me of is, I don't know, there was a movie they put out. It was called The Enemy Below, I believe, where a destroyer was chasing a submarine, and the submarine kept returning to the same course. It was trying to get back to its sub-pen in Germany. And the destroyer would repeatedly lose it, but the destroyer would turn to that course that submarine kept trying to get to and would eventually catch it. Right. And that reminded me of what these things were doing. They are consistently negative. The end result is always destructive or isolation or non-functionality or suicide or isolate. I mean, it's always negative.
Mm-hmm.
But, as I asked about the voices, I got pulled up by psychiatry several times saying, listen, don't be asking about the voices. It upsets the patients. What it did do that. And you're reinforcing the psychosis. So here they are cutting me off. And it, the patients and the voices got upset when I did ask about them. I have to grant them that. The voices didn't want the patients talking about them or telling anybody about them. And I couldn't understand that. That didn't make a lot of sense to me either. If you didn't watch how you questioned them, they would get upset. And if you pushed it too far, they would explode. And that scared psychiatry, and it caused problems for everybody. So I had to be real careful not to push them too far and just get piece by piece. And then, I kept asking psychiatry, well, what is the cause of this? Where do they come from? What are the voices? Oh, it's a chemical brain imbalance. Oh yeah. They acted like the brain was a car. It's like,
right.
Okay, it takes so many quarts of oil and so much brake fluid, and you put this much hydraulic fluid in it, and that's the balance that the machine's supposed to have.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you didn't have any friggin' idea what the chemical balance of the brain was supposed to be. There was nothing that indicated it's supposed to have this much serotonin, this much acetylcholine, this much, nothing. I mean, it's almost like they were just repeating this from what they heard in school. There were no charts.
Yeah.
There was nothing that indicated what the normal average chemical brain balance should be. I mean, and I'm like, this is absolutely bizarre.
Right.
But it was like, they're psychiatrists, they're doctors, and they say, okay, this is the way it is. Everybody else believe it. We're the medical guys. We're, trust us. We know everything. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. That distrust of authorities, just the red lights are coming on all over the place.
Right.
So it looked to me like they were just making these claims based on the programming they were given in medical school without questioning, any of the authorities who, gave that stuff to them. Why did several different antipsychotic medications that greatly varied in chemical composition and worked on very different neurotransmitters all reduce the same symptoms if
right.
this was a chemical brain imbalance? I mean, you're talking about vastly different chemicals that are acting on very different neurotransmitters. And psychiatry is not a very precise science. If one medicine doesn't work, they throw in another one. If that didn't work, they try another one until they find something that works. There is no precise, okay, it's supposed to have this much acetylcholine, this much serotonin, this much, nothing like that. It's a very sloppy science.
Right.
So one thing that was common among all the medications that they were giving these people were that they were all tranquilizers. They all calmed them down. Much of the time they didn't make the voices go completely away. Sometimes they did, but much of the time they didn't. It just toned them down, like it turned down the amplitude where they weren't as strong or they didn't have as much influence.
Well, and the individual couldn't act on that because they were sedated.
Well, yeah, they were sedated and they were calm. So they couldn't get as upset. They couldn't get as out of control. I mean, they were sedated.
Yeah.
And some of them were sedated so bad. I mean, I told you that the psychotic patients didn't like psychiatrists.
Right.
I mean, and they didn't like their medications. And I remember coming up onto the floor one day, and here's this new patient, with his shirt off. He was a black guy, thin, muscular, and he was boxing up and down the hall, shadow boxing. Okay. And he got my attention immediately. I went, well, this guy might be dangerous. So I kind of meandered over to him and asked, I said, hey, Leroy, what you doing, man? He goes, preparing for the fight, man. Oh, who are you going to fight? Can't tell you. Getting ready. And he just goes shadow boxing down the hall. So I watched him. He wasn't hurting anybody. He's just shadow boxing. Next day I come up and he's doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Next day I come up, he's doing the same thing. Hey, Leroy, when's the fight? He said, soon. I'm getting ready, soon. I'm like, I walked over to the attendant and I said, "What do you make of this guy?" And he goes, "Well, I don't know. He ain't hurt nobody yet, so we're just kind of leaving him alone." As we're standing there talking to each other, he's punching, all over the place. And another poor psychiatric patient comes meandering out of his room, and here's this guy punching all around him, and then goes off down the hall, and the guy's like wide-eyed coming down, and I'm like, "Whoa, what's going on with this guy?" So the next day I'm standing up there with the attendant, and here comes Dr. G up the stairs. He was an alcoholic psychiatrist, and he was the boxer's psychiatrist. So he comes up the stairs, all with his bloodshot eyes, and tops the top stair and starts walking across this huge day room. And out comes Leroy out of that hall like a friggin' torpedo, moving about 70 miles an hour, heading straight for Grant, man. And before this guy could even look up, Leroy landed like 2 or 3 punches on him and just knocked him flat.
Wow.
So next day I come up there and hear somebody slumped over in the corner there, which is unusual. You don't see them slumped over in the corner. I mean, usually they're walking around and they're sitting. This guy's slumped over in the corner, and I look and I see it's Leroy.
Uh-huh.
And I walk up to him, and he is so full of Thorazine that he's drooling on himself. And I said, "Leroy, what happened?" He goes, "Damn doctor." He had drugged him out of his mind.
Wow.
So, what became real clear was that, psychiatry wasn't treating the cause of this disease. They were treating the symptoms.
Well, that's true of most. That's true for the most, generally speaking, for the medical profession, right?
Well, you get an infection, something like that. They treat the infection, they kill it, and it goes away.
Usually,
there's some stuff like diabetes that you take it, and that, as long as you're balancing that out. But with this, if it didn't matter if you took the medications away, the voices returned.
Yes.
It was like putting a salve on an itch.
Yeah.
It was real clear that they weren't getting at the cause of whatever this was. They were treating the symptoms. And it was almost like they were just being produced in medical school, and this is what you did, and they weren't asking any questions. And I remember when I was in the doctoral program, they didn't want questions. They didn't want you challenging their authority. They didn't want you asking questions that, I got in a lot of trouble asking these people a lot of questions. I remember the head of the doctoral program, he was given a lecture once, and he gets up and he goes, "Does anybody have any questions at all over anything?"
Mm-hmm.
And the main question I wanted to know, that I thought they might be hiding in a doctoral program, was, where do thoughts come from? So I asked him, and man, he looked at me like, oh man, I red flagged myself.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, "I'll talk to you after the lecture." He never did.
Right.
I went up to him, he avoided me, but I found out later that I'd been red flagged, and that was one of the most important questions that I could think of.
Huh.
What are they, and where do they come from?
Right. Well, hang on just a second, Dr. J. I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back, and we can continue on this, all right?
You bet.
Thanks.
If UFOs are real, why don't they just land on the White House lawn? According to author Robert Stanley, UFOs did land on Capitol Hill in July 2002, but this is not the first time. In his new book, Close Encounters on Capitol Hill, Robert Stanley documents 224 eyewitness accounts of UFO sightings in D.C. from 1850 to 2006. This book also includes interviews with a dozen UFO experts. According to Robert Stanley, Washington, D.C. has the highest number of UFO sightings per square mile than anywhere else on Earth. How could this be possible, and what does it mean? Why has this fact been ignored by the media? It's high time for you to know the truth about the ongoing alien incursions of restricted airspace in Washington, D.C. Close Encounters on Capitol Hill is 408 pages of the most well-researched information ever written on the subject of UFOs and ETs. This controversial book is only available at unicusmagazines.com. That's spelled UNICUS magazine.com. Order your copy today.
All right, folks, we're back, and I do have 2 books at this point The second book is called Close Encounters in Washington, D.C. Oh, excuse me, Covert Encounters in Washington, D.C., and that's available at Amazon.com, or go to my website at unicusmagazine.com. Click on books. Please check out the free UFO image archive that I've created there. It is phenomenal, and you should know what's going on in our nation's capital that obviously the government doesn't want to talk about, unfortunately. So the other thing I would say is if you like this show, please, and you can, please donate. I do have a donate button there, and or please contact me if you have a service or a product you'd like to advertise on my radio station. I do really need some help with this, and I do appreciate your support. So if you can do that, I certainly appreciate it. All right, we're back now. Dr. J, welcome back to the show. And yeah, so we're talking about questions that you came up in your mind. Is that what led you to ultimately to realize that these voices were not in the patient's head per se?
No, that took a while longer because even though I didn't know what these things were, I halfway believed they might be hallucinations. There was a lot of stuff adding up that they weren't hallucinations, but I had no idea what they were. Mm-hmm. Nobody else seemed to know either. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of questions like, if they are hallucinations, why aren't they random like other hallucinations?
Sure.
Why do they constantly tell patients in such overwhelming numbers not to take their medications? Why does psychiatry, if a mental patient says, hey, I'm going to kill myself or somebody else, they jump? They're full of drugs real quickly.
Right.
What kind of disease would tell the patient not to take the meds? Why are they choosing psychosis over the side effects of the meds? There's all these things that just weren't adding up.
Right.
And what I was seeing was not consistent with what psychiatry was telling me about these things being hallucinations, but I didn't know what they were. But I was starting to think, well, they're not hallucinations. And, a quote from Einstein comes up here. It says, a man should not look for what is, or a man should look for what is, and not for what he thinks should be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what evidence do they have that these things are hallucinations? What evidence do they have that these things are the product of a biochemical brain imbalance? And if you push them hard enough, mm-hmm. and the drug company representatives also, if you ask them long enough and hard enough, they would have to admit they do not know what causes schizophrenia.
Mm.
They have to, and I have. They said, well, we really don't know what causes schizophrenia, but these are hallucinations, and it's, because it responds to these drugs, it must be a chemical brain imbalance.
Okay.
Then I started watching what was happening around the hospital. Psychiatrists were being assaulted at a level far above anybody else except attendants. And attendants were understandable. They were having to move patients. They were having to give them drugs. They were always there.
Uh-huh.
But past that, medical doctors, nurses, psych nurses, counselors, all these other people who worked with psychiatric patients were not being assaulted at the rate at which psychiatrists were. There was always a story coming through the grapevine of this psychiatrist getting pounded or that one, or, I told you the boxer story that got shot across the hall. And the one thing that kind of drove, it just really riveted my attention was one day I'm walking across this day room. Now, these were huge psychiatric units, and they were old, and there was a banister made out of hollow steel pipe. The bottom of the banister had a cap on it, a metal cap. The top of the banister did not have a metal cap. It was, it was open.
Mm-hmm.
And here I was one morning walking across the day room, and here's one of the maintenance men cutting the bottom off of this banister. And I'm like, well, I wonder why he's doing that, And it just riveted my attention, and I stopped and I watched, and here were sparks flying all over the place and smoke, and then the cap dropped off, and out of that banister, it was like winning a one-armed bandit thing in Las Vegas or something, poured hundreds, if not thousands, of pills.
Wow.
That they had been dumping in that banister for decades. They just came out of there like a gumball machine. And I was just, my mouth just dropped wide open, and these things were bouncing and dancing all over the floor. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of them. And I'm just standing there with my jaw wide open looking. Each one is a vote for a psychiatric patient not to take their medication.
Sure.
So I stooped down and I started looking at them, and the vast majority of them were antipsychotic drugs. They were the drugs that would have impacted the voices.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, holy cow, look at the magnitude of this. I mean, it was much larger than I had ever thought, you know. So it was like, whoa, you know. And despite this, psychology and psychiatry showed, you know, no interest in the voices. I mean, it was clear that if the voices disappeared, that psychiatric diagnosis disappeared. That mental illness disappeared. It was driven by the voices.
Right.
You know, if they left, the disease was gone. And yet they would study, you know, you'd see the psychologists studying stuff like, oh, how many people does it take to look up in the sky to make everybody else look up? Or what happens if people get into an elevator and they face the wrong way? There's all this ridiculous stuff, and yet they won't even look at the voices. Nobody has done a study of the voices or what they were, how they operated. There was nothing written on them. There, you know, they were. It was decreed that they were hallucinations, and period. That was it. Nobody went past that, and it was like, why? That struck me as so friggin' bizarre, especially in terms of the stuff that I was seeing and the massive problems that these voices caused, and they knew they were causing.
Yeah.
Because the patients would tell them, yeah, the voices told me to cut my wrist. The voices told me to escape from the hospital. You know, and still, you know, it was clear that the root of this problem were the voices. And still, they showed no interest, none. You know, as far as they're hallucinations, we say they're hallucinations. They have no proof they're hallucinations, but you know, that's the way it is. That's the way we've been taught. That's the way we've been taught for generations. You know, you want to go back to the Middle Ages, you could believe they're demons, but you know, modern science, they're hallucinations. You know, so I'm like, man, what is going on here? You know, this is the root of the problem, and they're not looking at it. You know, so I got nowhere with psychiatry. I finally gave up. I mean, it was, you know, they were closed. They were institutionalized. They weren't looking out of their box. They weren't willing to consider anything else. I mean, this is the way it was. This is what they were taught. This is how it's been for decades, and this is the way it is, and this is the way it's going to be. And one of these days, we'll find the biological root for this. No, they won't, because it doesn't exist.
Okay, so what was the tipping point for you? How did you come to this awareness that these things were actually external to the patient?
It started building up. So I started asking the patients, you know, because I was getting nowhere with psychiatry. And what I found is that when I started questioning the patients about the voices, they became more irritated. They became more agitated. And I was given warnings by psychiatry and other psychiatrists, don't be irritating, don't be talking to them about the voices. It irritates them, it sets them off, and then we have to deal with it, and you're reinforcing the hallucinations.
Right.
You know, and that was true. The voices didn't want to be talked about. The patients didn't want to talk about them. I mean, there was nothing positive about them telling people about voices. It was always negative. They would end up, you know, isolated. They would lose their friends. Everybody would think they're weird. Psychiatrists would drug them. There's no positive outcome, you know, for them to talk about the voices. None.
Right.
You know, but what I found is that if I made it, you know, when I started off, I thought, well, they were hallucinations, but if the patient picked that up, that I believed they were, and that I wasn't even giving them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, they wouldn't say anything. They wouldn't waste their time. They would just clam up. If I took a neutral stance, they would talk a lot more about them, despite the fact that the voices were screaming at them not to. You know? Okay. And if I asked them, well, what do you think they are? You know, I'd ask the patient, what do you think they are? And you know, the overwhelming majority would say, I think they're demons.
Really?
You know? And that's what they've been telling psychiatry for years, you know, which is not being heard at all. I mean, but yeah, the overwhelming would say they're demons, they're evil.
Is that why you contacted me? Because I'd been calling them demons or archons or something other than just a biochemical problem?
Well, yeah, Sherry found you first.
I see.
She turned me on. She goes, and I went, man, here's somebody who, he's in the ballpark.
Okay.
He's in the ballpark. So now let me help him out a little bit here.
Yeah.
And then when you brought Cameron on, Cameron was right on.
Okay.
You know, he was right on. You know, so after 7 years at working at that state hospital, you know, I had only learned a handful of, they were very important things, but only a handful, and it was information that didn't exist in other places. One thing I found was odd was that on Sundays when psychiatric patients were allowed to get off the wards and get out of the hospital and go to church, I mean, that was a big thing for them. The schizophrenics refused to go. They didn't like church, and they didn't like preachers.
Okay.
And I went, that's strange. And this was consistent, The voices didn't like to be, they didn't like inmates or patients asking or answering questions about them. They got upset.
Huh.
It was really odd that, schizophrenic patients would choose the horror, the hell of psychosis, rather than the side effects of the meds. It was a strange disease. I mean, what kind of disease would tell the patient not to take the medications that would weaken it? That's very strange.
Yeah.
The fact that it wasn't the notion that they were hallucinations just wasn't checking out an objective reality. Although I didn't know what they were, I mean, it just didn't match regular hallucinations. There was something very strange going on here. The voices consistently telling the person to negative things, running them down, insulting them, telling them to kill themselves, hurt other people. I mean, it wasn't like other hallucinations where they're positive, negative, or just neutral.
Mm-hmm.
This thing had a direction, whatever it was, and it was a negative direction. The schizophrenics in overwhelming numbers insisted the voices were demons, which is, that's strange, but since they were all negative and telling them to do all these rotten things, I mean, that was, that you could see where they would come to that conclusion. The other thing I found really strange was psychiatry and psychology would not permit investigation into these things. I mean, if they caught you talking about the voices with patients, you're reinforcing the hallucinations, man. You're making them worse. You're just, don't do that. You're just, they're hallucinations, and by giving them any kind of credence at all, you're making it worse. On the other hand, the patient's feeling abandoned, like nobody's listening to me. It's like they're cut off. Like, okay, you're crazy, you're having hallucinations, and nobody understands them. It's like, okay, if you have this stuff, we're going to drug you half to death, and they don't want to talk to people about that.
Right.
So the chemical imbalance theory just didn't check out. Things drastically changed after I went to work at for the psychology department of the state prison. I had a lot of latitude to investigate there.
I see.
So there were a number of schizophrenic patients who were just as curious or more so about the voices than I was.
You mean in the prison?
In the prison, it's like, I don't know what they are. They're not nice. They said, and they were willing to try some things. Like, okay, what impact does this have on them? If you do this, what do they say? What do they do? How do they act? What do they? And a lot of times, they would tell me, the voices are calling you, all these rotten names.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it became common. Like, they're calling you an asshole now. They're saying, don't listen to him. He's crazy. It was a lot of, but it always came through the prisoner.
Right.
They're telling me to tell you this. So. Lots of times, I'd ask them, how did the voices start? And it was interesting. It was like, when some of them, when they first started, it was like driving a new car. The voices would tell them, it was almost like they were trying to see how much control they had. They tell them, go pick up that pencil, or put your tongue on the mirror, or do these ridiculous things. It was almost like, how much control do I have over this mechanism?
Right.
And then the first prisoner that was really interested in the voices, I'll call him Preston. He used to be on the stock exchange in New York, a very successful guy, lots of money. He was married, had a big house in New York, started using cocaine, became psychotic, and lost it all.
Wow.
Eventually ended up in prison and with a bunch of voices. And he was the first one that was willing to kind of sit down and tell me about these things.
Okay.
And he was married for like 21 years or something like that. And I'd ask him, I said, how did you do that? Didn't your wife know that you were hearing these things? And he'd go, no, well, I hid them from her. I'd go out in the garage and I'd talk to him and, she'd catch me sometimes, and I'd tell her I was just talking to myself. And eventually, he got to where he couldn't function, and his wife was threatening with divorce. And the voices didn't like his wife. They don't like wives. They don't like kids. They would always tell him she's cheating on him, and finally she had enough, and she was going to leave him. And he didn't care at all.
Wow.
It was like, okay, fine. That's okay. That's even better. But he had no real good source of income then. He'd lost his job. He was about to crash. And when she saw that he didn't care at all about her, she was furious. I mean, just absolutely furious. And she just gutted him. She just took everything she could from him. He ended up a bum in the living in Central Park in a cave and listening to the voices. And,
in a cave?
Well, it's kind of like a nook or a rock kind of overhang or something like that. And he would eat, he would find these restaurants that threw out food at the end of the day.
Wow.
And he was happy doing this, and the voices were happy doing this.
Okay, so
this is
the people. So some of these people that I've seen living on the streets that are they're talking to themselves. They're really not talking to themselves. They're talking to the voices.
No. Exactly.
Oh Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh Jesus.
Yeah. The mental health system in the United States is awful. I mean, these people can't get medications. The medications are expensive.
Yeah.
To keep a guy on Zyprexa, one of the later antipsychotics, $800 a month. A month to maintain your sanity.
That's just for one drug, right? I mean, sometimes they're on multiple.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The drug companies are making a killing.
Literally.
That, they're treating the symptoms. They're not getting at the thing.
Yeah.
So this fella, I mean, he preferred to be with the voices and eating, stuff out of garbage cans and stuff, and finally we would start working with, okay, do you want to get rid of these things? Do these things, do opposite of everything they say.
Right.
And I would support him in that. And I said, listen, if you need us, you come to my office and I'll help you out. I'll, just keep moving in a positive direction. Finally, one day he's sitting there and the voices got fed up and they were getting weaker and weaker because he was doing positive things. He wasn't listening to what they were doing. I was supporting him.
Yeah.
He said that they screamed and then they left.
Wow.
And he's sitting there stunned, just stunned. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, is he okay? And he couldn't get up. He was disoriented, And he was like just looking at me. And what happened? He said they screamed and they left. And he said the silence is deafening because he's heard them for decades, And I'm like, wow, man. They left. And I kept track of him, so I'd bring him back every once in a while. They still gone? They're still gone? They're still gone? Yeah. But he came in, he was reporting he was lonely.
Of course.
They were his only friends.
Right. You remember there's a part, remember that part of the last book by Carlos Castaneda's where he is finally shown these things and Don Juan warns him that if a person gets to a point in their life where they can actually dismiss these things, that they're left in a very, very weakened state, almost like an infant?
Yeah, and that is true. That's exactly what I saw.
Wow.
And Carlos Castaneda and Miguel Ruiz, these Indian shamans, they've known about these things for thousands of years.
Long time, yeah, right. And so did right, and so did the Gnostics. And I believe that's one of the reasons that the library at Alexandria had to be destroyed, is because there was too much information there, too many writings about these things that would have exposed them to the populace in general.
Well, they don't want to be exposed.
No.
They don't like what we're doing right now, that's for sure.
Yeah,
So, it turns out that this fella was so lonely that he called for him back.
Oh, no.
And he was working in the prison doing motor vehicle, answering the phones and stuff. And I stopped by one day to see him, and he goes, yeah, I brought him back. I'm not lonely anymore. I'm okay. This is how I want.
Huh.
He was telling me the story about this one psychotic guy that called him on the phone one day. And we were both laughing about this.
Uh-huh.
And the guy was screaming at his voices over the phone, and Preston didn't know whether they were his voices or the other guy's voices. We were just rolling over that. The next one that was really fascinating was, I'll call him Lewis. he was a cocaine addict in San Diego. And he was psychotic and hearing voices and, drug abuser. And, at the time he was telling me this, the voices were gone. But, he said, the voices told me that there was a pot field in Oregon. And to pack up two big burlap bags, and he had like $250 at the time, and take his money, and they would show him where this pot field was.
Uh-huh.
I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I got the burlap bags, took the money, and just was following their direction every step of the way. He drove from San Diego all the way up to Oregon, down like 30 miles of dirt road, and the road dead-ended. And he goes, okay, now what? And the voices said, take your burlap bags and go up that hiking trail off to your left there.
Uh-huh.
So he walked 4 hours up that hiking trail. He got to the top of the mountain, and here's this huge sesamelia pot field.
Wow.
So he goes, man, wow. And he goes, he cuts down 2 burlap bags full, and he takes it back down to his car, and he goes, okay, now what do I do? And the voices say, well, we know where there's a park, you can sell it. So they direct him to the park. I'm honest to God. Honest to God, and I'm sitting there with my mouth wide open. He goes, well, they told me exactly where the park was. I went there. He said he sold hundreds of dollars worth of marijuana. He bought all the prostitutes that he could handle. He bought all the cocaine he could handle, all the liquor he could handle.
Uh-huh.
And he was having the life of Riley. And he said the voices were fishermen. They wanted to go fishing.
What?
I go, what? Yeah, that's what I said. What? He said, yeah, we went out onto the Columbia River, and he said the voices would tell him where to cast his hook, how long to leave it there, when to leave, when to move, and he was the only one on the river catching fish, and everybody else was looking at him going, how's he doing that?
Okay.
This went on for 2 weeks, prostitutes, cocaine, alcohol, and then he went to go up there at the end of 2 weeks, and they said, nope, they're up there waiting for you. Go up there now, they'll kill you. You pack up your car, pack up the money you had, and he left with a lot more money than he came with, and go back to San Diego. And he did. They warned him,
Huh.
So I'm like listening to this, and we go, holy mackerel, Andy. Since then I talked to a number of prisoners that were hearing voices, and they would tell the prisoner which houses to rob, when to go in there, and when somebody was up, and when to get out.
Whoa.
This one, oh yeah, they would tell them where to get drugs.
Okay, hold on. This is why Dr. Ruiz, was it?
Yeah,
the Ruiz.
Miguel,
yeah, Dr. Ruiz, in his book, he claiming to be a Toltec, whatever, he says that these things are allies. So, so on some level,
so does Castaneda.
Well, he sort of. Not, yeah, at some point he does kind of mention, or Don Juan admits to him that some of these allies are actually the flyers, and that they shapeshift and whatever. Look, the point I'm trying to make is there's a way to have a symbiotic relationship with these things because they are intelligent. Because as long as they're getting something out of you, they want to keep you around. Okay, so at that point, it's not 100% parasitic. I mean, I think they look at us as being expendable, but do you agree with what I'm saying?
Not completely, because
okay.
I think these ones, they may have been talking about a slightly different something there, because they could use those things. But they, Castaneda did say that they are attracted to negative emotion.
Okay.
And he said their frequency is much more like electricity, where ours is more like heat. I think what, I got ahead of myself with those 2 stories. I think where I was first mowed over by these is I called one prisoner in there, and I read him something that Miguel Ruiz had written saying these things are parasitic, they are invisible entities, and they suck negative energy out of you after, and I wanted to know what this prisoner thought about this.
Yeah.
Because we were working for months together, and the voices were getting weaker and weaker and weaker. He was gaining more and more control. He was staying out of trouble with security.
Yeah.
He was getting better and better. And, I would ask him everything about the voices, and he would tell me, despite the fact that they beat him up a lot. He would get headaches, he would get sweats, he would still squeal on them. So I brought in this quote, and that was the one I sent you in that story before, where this was, I think, from Miguel Ruiz, where he's saying these things are parasitic entities. They live off of negative emotional energy. They exist on the Earth plane just like we do. They've been here as long as we have, or maybe even longer.
Right.
And they treat us like cows. I mean, you know, like cows. We put them out to pasture to milk. They eat the grass. We isolate them. We milk them, put them back out there again.
Yeah.
These things, we generate emotional energy, and that's what these things feed off. They can't generate their own emotional energy.
Right.
So I read that to this guy, and I was wanting his opinion, and but even before that, I got ahead of myself again. There was one day where he comes into my office and he says, "The voices want to talk to you," and they want to talk directly to me. They'd never done that before. They always went through the patient. You know, it's like, oh, he's the voices are telling me to tell you that you're a jerk, you're crazy, you're all this rotten stuff. And I'd say, well, tell them they're a bunch of fools and jerks, and you know, they can eat crap and die. And you know, we'd have those kind of exchanges. I didn't know what I was talking to, but you know, I wasn't sure whether it was a separate part of the patient's mind or as a subconscious or bad program. I mean, it just. I was confused until this guy comes in. He goes, the voices want to talk to you. And this is the first time that ever happened. And I was kind of taken back because they never addressed me directly.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting back there like, man, what is going on here? And I said, okay, what do they have to say? And he looks me in the eye and his voice changes just a little bit. And he goes, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. And it just blew me away. I mean, our way of life. This wasn't just the guy talking. This wasn't just, it's our. This is plural now.
Yep.
You know, and I'm like, holy cow, they are entities. You know, that's where I first realized, like you asked, when did you first realize? It was then. You know, and I walked out of the office that day and I went, my God, they are entities. They have an individual intent. They have a different intent. They are intelligent. You know, this wasn't the patient talking.
Right.
And I'm like, holy cow, what am I getting into here? You know, but I wouldn't let go. Now I was intensely curious. So with the same guy, I kept working with him. He's getting better. And then I read him that quote from Miguel Ruiz one day.
Yeah.
I was reading at home. I brought the book in. I said, I'm going to ask, Michael what he thinks of this quote where, the medicine man is saying these are entities. They feed off of negative emotional energy. They exist with us. They're inorganic beings. Yeah. And I read him that, and I look up after I'm done reading, and he's staring at me with this zombie-like stare, and I'm like, it sent chills up my back, and he's just staring at me, and I'm like, whoa, something bad's going on here. So I push my chair against the office wall just in case he's going to come at me. There's a guard up in the front of the medical unit, but usually it's a female. She couldn't do anything. By the time she got there, this guy'd probably have his hands around my neck or something. So I'm getting ready to kick him off if I need to. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, off to my right, there's this loud, like an arc welder, loud electrical crackle. And I'm like, what is that? I look over there and I see nothing. And then I look back at him and he's just staring at me with this weird, zombie-like psychotic stare. And this crackle starts moving up my office wall to the right, toward the ceiling at about a 45-degree angle. And I'm looking to see if I can see anything there, but I'm afraid to take my eyes off of him because I'm thinking he's going to jump me any minute. And here I am flashing back and forth, seeing if I could see anything. I could not see anything, but it was very loud. It started moving along the right-hand wall. It hit the wall over his head, turned over his head. And then... and he's looking at me the whole time with this zombie-like stare. He's completely motionless. It hits the left-hand wall and starts coming down the left-hand wall at a 45-degree angle. And I'm like, oh, man, what is going on here? And then it jumps into a Rubbermaid trash can right to the left of my foot. And that trash can is absolutely empty. The porters had emptied it the night before, and all there is a plastic bag. And I can look down in there. There is nothing there.
Yeah.
And I'm looking between him and this noise, afraid that, if I'm paying too much attention to whatever this thing is, I didn't smell anything, I didn't feel anything, but man, it was loud. And then it jumps in the trash can, it rattles there for a while, and then it disappears as suddenly as it came. And I look at him, and I go, "Did you hear that?" And he doesn't answer. He's just staring at me like he's in a zombie or something. And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? And then he slowly gets up, and he goes, "I gotta leave." And he shuffles down the hall. And I'm like, thank heavens, he's getting out of here.
Yeah.
And I'm in absolute shock. I mean, I'm like, what just happened here? And after he walks out, I start checking all the offices all the way down the hall. There is nobody there. I go back to my office. I search everything. There is no cause for this noise. None. Zero. And I just I closed the door, and I was just non-functional that whole entire day. I'm going, if this thing can do that, if it can affect physical reality, what else can it do? How much danger am I in? What am I getting into? That's when I contacted Wilson Van Dusen, who wrote The Presence of Other Worlds. He worked at a state hospital in California, and he actually gave, he thought they were, he could make friends with the voices. He was interesting. It took me a while to get through to him, but he had patients he was trying to make friends with the voices so he could find out what they were and how they operated. I knew they were no good from the start.
Yeah.
He treated them like friends. He actually gave an MMPI to a patient and then had the patient's voice respond to that same MMPI. And he said that the voices MMPI came out much more psychotic than the patient's. I found that interesting.
What is an MMPI? What is that test?
It's like the chief test of clinical psychologists. It's like their holy grail.
Well, I mean, is it like a lie detector? I mean, is it hooked up?
Yeah, it's got several lie scales. No, it's a paper and pencil test.
Oh, okay.
It's called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's got a bunch of scales that measure all these different diagnoses.
Gotcha.
And, it's got lie scales and validity scales, and it's probably the most researched test that psychologists use.
I see.
So, I found that after that, I was afraid to call this guy back for about a month.
Yeah,
I was
sure.
like, oh man, finally, my curiosity got the best of me, and I put out a pass and had the guards bring him over to my office one morning about 3 weeks later. And he comes in, he's all smiley, and I was expecting that he would just be eaten up by these things. Mm-hmm. And he goes, "No, I've been doing what you said, and I'm doing real good. I'm going to AA, I'm going to my programs." And I was shocked, that he was still doing so good after what I just thought. I thought that just the very opposite would be happening after what I experienced.
Right.
And then finally, neither one of us talked about that incident for a while. And then finally I got around to saying, "Hey man, did you hear that crackling the last time you were here?" And he goes, "Yeah, I did." And he goes, "I'm surprised you did."
Yeah.
Talking to me.
Yeah.
And I'm going, "Yeah." I said, "What was it?" He said, "That was them. That was the voices." And I went, "What were they trying to do?" He said, "Well, they were trying to scare you." And I said, "Well, they did a damn good job."
Yeah.
So, I asked him, he was in that kind of zombie-like state as he was ready to leave the office, and I was curious about what was going on with him in that state.
Right.
So I asked him, I said, what were the voices telling you as you left the office? And he said, well, they were telling me to go get and I was thinking, I'd worked with this guy for some 6 months. We had a really good relationship. And he said the voices were telling me to go get a shank, which is
a knife,
a homemade prison knife.
Yeah.
Stick it in your belly.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, oh well, he didn't do it because we're kind of friends, kind of thing, and I'm trying to help him out. I said, well, why didn't you do it? And he said, because I couldn't find one, and nobody would give me one.
Wow.
I went, whoa.
Yeah.
So that's where I kind of realized that these things were dangerous.
Yeah, they really are. And as we were saying before, they really don't want us to be doing what we're doing. You have done a lot of great work quietly behind the scenes, and actually you have to do it in secret. Otherwise, you could lose your job or be sued by the mental health profession. Doesn't approve of what you're doing, right?
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Matter of fact, I got called in front of an inquisition at the prison demanding to know what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
They were questioning the prisoners. And there was one that they cornered. He was one who heard the voices had disappeared. He stopped taking his medicines, which, according to psychiatry, that can't happen.
Yeah.
So the chief psychologist goes, why'd you stop taking your meds? Well, the voices went away. I was talking to this guy and me, and he started demanding of that prisoner what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Of course, he couldn't tell him. So what he responded in turn was, he's helping us, not like you, asshole.
Uh-huh.
And I went, oh, my God.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah.
So the psychologist had a valid MMPI profile on this particular prisoner before I started working with him, and it showed that he was psychotic. So he asked the prisoner, will you take another one now that you stopped taking your medicine? And he did. And it came out to be a valid profile, and it did not show psychosis.
Wow.
So my supervisor at that point went nuts. I mean, I thought he'd be happy.
Yeah.
Hey, you don't have to give this guy any more medicines, man. You don't have to worry about him anymore. He's off and running. He's back in school. And no. I was experimenting with prisoners, and that was very dangerous, and that was against all rules and regulations. So I got called up in front of an inquisition, in front of the medical director, the chief psychiatrist, the chief psychologist, and they were all hammering me as to, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I couldn't tell them.
Right, but if you had their permission, it would have been fine. If you'd had legally had some authority to do that within their parameters, it would have been fine, right?
Yeah, but you're not going to get it.
No, I understand. I'm just saying it's hypocritical. Look, there's also I'm trying to lead you to a point where you understand something. When I agreed to, I appreciate you sharing your information with me, right? And I put it out on the show, and we agreed to help each other. I was attacked by these things.
Oh, were you?
Well, yeah, and look, it's not the first time. Okay, this is how I came to this awareness, was accidentally assisting somebody who was being attacked by them, and I didn't know that. Okay, so that was many years ago, but I know better now. But I wasn't really cognizant that it was going to happen all over again by agreeing to work with you on some level. Okay, so like I said, that feeling in my teeth ultimately drove me to the dentist after a couple weeks, and I want you to imagine that electricity that was going through the wall, if that was channeled to the nerve endings of the root of your tooth or a tooth, how you would feel, because that's what they were doing to me. That's what they were doing to me, and it was. How do I know that? Okay, that's a very weird, crazy thing to say. Well, because at some point, I went to the dentist, and he said, well, the x-ray shows nothing, and you have no swelling. He goes, I don't know what to tell you. He says, but, next time you feel that electricity going through your face, call me. And I thought, wait a minute, I never said anything about electricity to him, okay? I just said I was in a lot of pain, and because it wasn't constant, And man, when it came, it was horrible. I mean, it was absolutely knocking me to my knees at times. And I'm thinking, I'm going to lose a tooth. I'm going to have root canal, something. But so it made no sense at all, right? And then after seeing the dentist, I'm like, well, there's something wrong. And then I looked and I actually saw some bumps in the top of the roof of my mouth. So I thought, well, I'll go see an ear, nose, throat guy. I go and see him. He goes, oh, no problem. You've got a virus in your mouth. He says, those are like cold sores. I said, so what do I do? He goes, nothing. I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, you can gargle with this stuff, and it'll help kill the pain, but it's not going to kill the virus. And I thought, bullshit. No, that's not how it works. But thanks. Here's my money. Goodbye. And I immediately started to treat it with homeopathic things that I know deal with viruses, right? Including light. Oddly, my good friend of mine, he's a healer. He told me
they wouldn't like that.
no, they don't like the light at all. And here's how I know it is because my friend had told me to get this very powerful red LED, which I did. I went to a sporting goods store and got a headlamp that had 3 very, very, very high beam thing. And but I couldn't really put it on my tooth, so I was putting it through like the side of my face. It was so powerful, it go right through the cheek, right? But that wasn't helping. So once I realized it's a virus and it's in my mouth, I started to not only take this homeopathic thing, but I literally put the headlamp in my mouth, and was beaming the light into my whole entire inside of my mouth was lit up like a jack-o'-lantern, right? And the damn virus migrated away out of my mouth down into my esophagus. And I thought, oh my God, this is crazy. This is really, and it hurt too. I mean, the pain had now migrated out of my mouth into my esophagus, and I'm like, God bless this stuff, whatever it is. So, but at least I knew I was fighting. I knew what I was fighting against, and I had some way to, some tricks. I had some tools at my disposal. And the battle had begun, really, at that point. Before they really had me. They had me bad. So, and it was...
Yeah, if you don't know what it is, you can't fight it.
No. Well, but here's the thing.
Add to your story there is after these prisoners started recovering, the first handful of them, at about 3:30 or 4 in the morning, I would feel crushed into the bed. It was like something was crushing me into my bed, and I could feel it.
Yeah.
My whole body was being crushed, and I was terrified. So I started praying and asking for Jesus and guardian angel to drive these things away, and they eventually went. And there was an exorcist working at the prison who I found out through another inmate, because one of the ones that I had helped went and told him. And I went and talked to him. I said, what is going on with this? Because, I had nobody to talk to. I can't talk to my wife. She's terrified.
Yeah.
You can't talk to anybody you work with because they think you're a lunatic. So I went to him and I said, what is going on here? And he goes, don't worry about that. They do that to scare you. Happened a million times. It's like it's old hat.
Yeah.
That I'm like, holy cow. So that happened several times. And now, they even gave up on doing that because after a while it didn't bother me. But now I can feel them when they're there.
Right.
And they come out at the point where I'm telling somebody that these things are entities and they are parasites, and they feed off of negative emotional energy. That's why you're being fed all this negative stuff all the time. Kill yourself. It generates negative emotional energy, and then there's a huge energy drop. Right. Where after the voices leave, these people are drained. They're absolutely drained. They can't get out of bed. They have no energy. And you ask them, where's the energy go? Well, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's...
These things take it.
Dr. J, that's exactly what was happening to me, especially at night. The pain would increase, causing me not only discomfort, but alarm. And I wake up exhausted in the morning, okay? But when I finally realized that it was a virus, and I knew that I was actually going to defeat this on a physical level, I was also working on a spiritual level, because at that point I recognized what was going on, that this virus was actually an extension of these creatures, these demonic entities. And as I was laying there prior to falling asleep, I had one of the most strangest experiences where my entire body jerked. Okay, and I wasn't falling asleep at that point. I literally had this jolt, and I heard a cracking noise like electricity, but it was very brief, and I saw a flash of light. And at that point, I thought, okay, they're leaving. That's what I thought. When my wife woke up in the morning, she said, I had a really weird dream last night that someone was trying to bore a hole through your aura and attach something to your head.
Wow.
And I know, and I said to her, I don't think so. I think they were detaching something. I think that was actually somebody there to assist, because I was asking for assistance. Believe me, I needed help. And I'm not bashful. I'm not so prideful that I wouldn't ask for help from divine beings when it comes to these unholy creatures. So,
yes.
But I mean, it was shocking. I mean, really, this whole process, though, ultimately, the reason I'm mentioning it, because it actually made me stronger. Once again, every time they attack me, it motivates me to go further into the light and to embrace it more, even more so. Okay, so they're not really distracting or taking me off my path. If anything, unintentionally, they've actually emboldened me to do more for not only for myself but for others. It's really odd how that happens.
Well, you know what may be a little shocking to your listeners is that at least I'm talking about, this became very clear because I was working with the top, 5% of the population.
Yeah.
Where it becomes very clear.
Yeah.
But the truth is that all of you people out there listening are being attacked by these things constantly.
Yes.
They are putting negative thoughts in your head and trying to get you to act on them. And they can smell negative emotion like a shark can smell blood.
Yeah.
If something bad happens, they will amplify it.
Yep.
And then you'll feel that you are weakened after you get all upset. They live off of negative emotional energy, and they will put every negative thought that comes into your head is put there by them.
Right. Right. So that's an excellent point. I'm glad you made that. You don't have to be clinically diagnosed as being schizophrenic or psychopathic to be under the influence to some degree of these entities that we're talking about here.
Yeah. And that's why the Bible has, forgive your enemies.
Right.
Concentrate on positive stuff, and that's another thing. That, you ask these schizophrenic guys to read the Bible, they can't do it. They can't concentrate. The voices kick up. They start screaming. They start hollering. They won't let them concentrate. If they go into it, you're ever sitting in a church and somebody gets up and runs out? That's probably one of them.
Well,
they cannot stand the church. They cannot stand the Bible. But if you give them a horror story to read, they can remember every single detail of that horror story. So it's like these things are reinforcing the negative.
Yeah.
So as human beings moving into this new higher frequency we're all moving into, when something good happens to you, amplify it, just like they amplify the back.
Right.
Do things that are good for you. Do things that you enjoy. Love yourself. Don't act out of fear because they can smell fear like a dog attacking when you run.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. You know what? Actually, I was thinking too. Okay, so the virus that they put in me, they put in so many others to manipulate our genes and DNA. But they are a virus in this universe. I really think they came from outside. I don't think a loving God would have created these things, okay? That's my whole point. And that this is an illness, that evil really is an infection, much like a dog that has rabies. It could be a loving, sweet dog, but if it gets infected with that particular that disease, right, that parasite, it causes that animal to go into a very, very violent state of being.
Well, I think yes and no. I mean, it's just like there would be no light without darkness. There would be no heat without cold. If you didn't have the evil, if you didn't have the darkness, you would not be able to see the light or make the choice. If God said, okay, everything is going to be positive, you would lose your free will. You have the free will to choose between negative and positive, and the more negative choices you make, the more self-destructive choices you make, the more choices you make to increase the negativity in your mind, the further down that dark hole you travel. On the other hand, if you start choosing positive stuff, moving in a positive spiritual direction, doing things that you enjoy, helping other people, helping yourself, and move in a positive direction, that's going to increase.
Right.
So, without them, and I have no doubt that God allows them to exist, but it allows them to exist to teach us a lesson. If that's the direction you want to move, you're going to end up like these psychotic patients here. And if you look at their background, a lot of the times they were molested, they were beaten, they were tortured. A lot of very bad things happened to these people. I'd hear about a prisoner who did all these horrendous things, and I go, man, what a disgusting guy. And then I'd look into his background and find out he was tortured, he was locked in the closet, he was burnt by cigarettes, he was starved, he was molested. I mean, all these horrible things, that generate a ton of emotional negative energy, and these things feed on that. That's a treasure trough. The prisons are goddamn cesspools for these things. I mean, you walk into a prison and you can just feel it, the heavy, negative, no good thing will be unpunished in one of those places.
Okay, since you mentioned it, the only time I've been imprisoned was because, believe it or not, was for a traffic violation. I had one headlight out, okay, and the guy pulled me over, gave me a ticket that said I had to fix it. Well, I fixed it, but I never appeared in traffic court, so it went to a warrant. Years later, the police came to my apartment when I was a young man, in my 20s, and because of a noise complaint. They said, "What's your name?" I told them. Give us your ID. I did. They go, "We have a warrant for your arrest." I'm like, "What? What are you talking about?" They go, "Yep, come on." And I'm like, "Oh, Jesus." I couldn't believe it, but then they weren't going to, what are you going to do at that point? So I had to, they handcuffed me, put me in the thing, took me down. So fortunately, my friends were there. They called my family and they immediately arranged for bail. But it takes time. So what happened was they transferred me from the city jail down to the main prison downtown, and they didn't really book me into the system because bail had been posted, right? But I was there long enough to see how they strip people down, spray them down, take all your stuff, and I mean I got a tour. I got a tour of an inside of a prison. It wasn't like hardcore. I mean, but it was big enough, bad enough. I've never seen anything like that before. Unless you've been there, you don't know what the hell. I mean, if you've only seen it on TV, you've never ever experienced how bad it is. The vibe there is horrible, right? So but I was only there for not even a complete night. Okay, they booked me in the afternoon, and I was out later that evening. But here's what happened: I'm in a holding cell with some guys. And we're just sitting around, and nothing much is going on. I'm trying to ignore these people. Because I didn't want to start anything, seriously, because I don't know who these guys are or what they're in there for. But at one point, I saw there was an old black man who was, and there was all kinds of races of people there, but there was a lot of racism going on with the guards. It was really weird how they used that as a means, a way of demeaning the prisoners. It was just another tool for them to really just come down hard on them emotionally.
They do that.
But here, let me hold on.
Hold on. Guard to work in those places.
Yeah, obviously I could see they enjoyed it because I know
Yes.
I know that power trip. That there have been times in my life that I actually enjoyed controlling other people that way when I was a security guard. To some extent, it made me feel better because I was really in a bad state emotionally there for a while. But here's what happened. So I'm sitting there, and I saw this old black guy. He's laying on the cement underneath one of the metal benches that they have there, bolted to the wall. And I happen to still have my jacket on because, like I said, they didn't strip me down and spray me or whatever and take my clothes and give me prison clothes. I still had my clothes. So I took off my jacket, and I walked over, and I rolled it up, and I handed it to the guy laying on the floor, so he could use it as a pillow. And then I went back across the cell, and I sat down, and here comes these three guys, and they just sit down next to me, and they go, "You know anything about Jesus?" And I said, "Well, like what?" And they just started talking to me. They started talking to me about all these miraculous things, and it's like, that never would have happened. I mean, it literally changed the whole aura of my being there and their demeanor. The people that sat there with me, they really wanted to talk to me about spiritual things, about the things of light, the goodness. And in the midst of all that darkness, all it took was one act of kindness like that from me to shift the energy in that cell,
Yeah.
And look, I wasn't trying to do anything. It was a reflex. It's like, damn, if I was laying on that floor, I would wish that I had, at least have a pillow, for Christ's sake, And so I gave it to him, and in return, I was given this beautiful brotherhood for a moment there with these guys. I'll probably never see them again. But like I said, our conversation was elevated. Our something about the relationship had completely shifted. We weren't looking at each other as like rats in a cage anymore. We were seeing each other as fellow souls, and it was, man, that was a heck of an experience. I never want to go back to that, obviously, but I'm just telling you, that was wild.
Yeah, as you were talking, I remember, the atmosphere in the prison. The psychotic prisoners in the prison they're supernaturally strong.
Yeah.
I mean, because of the negative energy. I remember watching this little 100-pound psychotic guy bounce 3 big guards around the inside of a cell like they were popcorn.
Wow.
And there was another unit where a schizophrenic guy he got totally naked, and he was running all over the prison yard, and they could not catch that sucker. He just had so much energy. But I think that the head one was this never ceased to amaze me. It happened in the main big prison in another city. But I talked to several people who witnessed it, and this was a huge psychotic guy, a prisoner, and they had him locked up in maximum security, and they wanted to move him to another cell, and they wanted to do it right now. So they asked him to come out of there, and they go, "No, I'm not coming out. You come and get me."
That's not good.
And they weren't about to do that. They said, "Well, you come out of there. We're going to get the pepper spray."
Uh-huh.
He goes, "Yeah, go ahead and get your pepper spray, you bunch of punks." So they got these big quart cans of pepper spray. I mean, and that's awful stuff. And he saw him coming, and he put a towel around his head and wrapped himself in sheets, and they just drenched him in this stuff.
Uh-huh.
And that just made him more furious. I mean, a normal person would have been brought to their knees. And he took that off, and he goes, "Yeah, come on in, punks, man. Come and get me out of here." Nobody was going to do that at that point.
Yeah.
So they said, you come out of there, or we're going to go get the stun guns. There's 50,000 volts where these wires that they shoot into you.
Right.
And, I mean, one of those things, you get hit with one of those, and it'll knock the biggest guy to their feet. They put 2 of those in this guy. They shot him twice. And they started pumping him one after the other. One is recharging, the other one's discharging, 50,000 volts. Boom,
wow.
boom, boom.
Wow.
And he's just standing there shivering. I mean, no normal person could do that. The warden was there at that time. There was a small army of guards out there.
Right.
All these cell extraction guys with all this armor plate and shields and all this stuff standing. And they're hitting him, boom, boom, 17 times. Finally, the warden goes, "Hey, man, they're going to get me for cruel and unusual punishment. You better stop that." And I mean, this guy's just standing there quivering, with that voltage. And they stopped. He ripped those things out, and they said, "You don't come out of there. We're going to go get the dog."
Uh-oh.
And the prisoners they're terrified of the dogs because they're trained attack dogs. So he goes, "You punks, go ahead and get your dog."
What?
And they went and got the dog, and here's the attack dog at the ready, and they cracked the cell, and this guy's sitting on the edge of his bed, and the dog runs in there. He throws up his forearm, and the dog clamps onto it.
Uh-oh.
And it doesn't just clamp on and just bite once. I mean, it's chewing his arm to hamburger meat.
Oh, Jesus.
And he's bleeding like a stuck pig. And he pulls his arm up so he's face to face with that dog, looking the dog straight in the eye, and the dog doesn't let go, and he tells the dog, he goes, "Sit." And the dog sits, but it doesn't let go of his arm.
Uh-huh.
And the dog handler's going, "What the devil is going on in there?" So they open the door, and they have the dog tied to a rope, and they're pulling on the rope so that his arm is going one way. The cell extraction team goes in there, and they grab his arms and legs, and they're pulling the other way.
Uh-huh.
And this guy's fighting them off, and he injures several of them seriously by the time they get him out of there.
Uh-huh.
And then they beat the crap out of him,
of course,
and they take him and put him into another cell. They could have turned off the water. Eventually, not giving him any food. Eventually, he would have come out of there.
Yeah.
But no, they have this hard ass. You're not gonna. Oh man. But that was superhuman strength, and I've seen that so many times. They have. The scariest one was a devil worshiper once that I spoke to him. I mean, some of the horrible things they did was, it's like, and I asked him one time. I said, "Do you ever see Satan?" And he goes, "Yeah, I've seen him." And I was expecting it to be some horrible. He said, "No, he's beautiful.
Right.
He's absolutely beautiful."
Right.
And he was telling me these stories where he could travel from where he was spiritually into certain cells in the main prison and communicate with and see what's going on in those cells. 200 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
But he had this strange affect to him, like that. I don't know what that horror movie is with the puppets, where the puppets had that strange affect. And he didn't look like he was low on energy like a lot of the other psychotics.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, where do you get your energy? And he said, they give it to me.
Right.
I said, for what? He goes, well, they want me to do certain things, and they give me the energy I need to do that.
Right.
And I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, see, and that's what I'd said to you before about that would not be considered a parasitic relationship, because they are having some symbiosis where they're cooperating with each other on a negative level.
Oh, they were in league. That's for sure.
Right. So, and some people are, and this is what I'd said to you before privately off the air. I really believe that Satan, Lucifer, whatever you want to call these legion of human demons or devils, the fallen angels, are really infected by these shadow beings, these amoeba-like creatures, and that's something that happened a long time ago. It didn't start here on this planet. So, I know that's not really part of your worldview, but I'm just mentioning it again because people have never heard that before. At least most people I talked to never ever heard that before, even considered that's a possibility. But even the Vatican is admitting extraterrestrials do exist, and that some of them may actually be free of original sin, which I do agree with. The Bible says that only a third of the angels fell. So, in my opinion, these angelic beings that they talk about are really not other dimensional. They're our ancestors. They're the divine human beings that were created by the same God that created us, and they populate this entire universe. It's just unfortunate that some of them are infected with these entities. They hear voices too, and they do they follow the directive of negativity, and that's it's one of the reasons this planet's in such a bad shape. They're running the show, unfortunately, in my opinion.
Yeah, it looks like it, especially with this Monsanto thing that they just came up, where they're now immune from federal prosecution,
right,
for no matter what they do. I remember you telling me about somebody who called you after you did a broadcast and said, yeah, you have no right to interfere with their way of life, and this guy was sticking up for them.
Yeah, it was actually an email that was sent to the person who was interviewing me and had posted it on YouTube, and that thing went around the world. And I mean, that was 2 years or more ago, and I'm still getting email about that.
Wow.
So they, like I said, these entities and the humans and other humanoid extraterrestrials that they infest or have infected, they're out there. They're around us. They definitely are an issue. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, was because you lend credibility to this conversation in a way that other people that I've had on, although I respect Cameron and so many other people in this field, you're coming from a clinical psychological or mental health professional that's saying, you've come to this awareness over a period of time. You've had success dealing with these things as separate entities outside of the patient. And, I really appreciate what you've done and what you will hopefully continue to keep doing.
Yeah, I may end up paying for this, but
I hope not.
The truth's got to go out. I found it fascinating that this guy who wrote you used the same verbiage that guy told me.
Right.
You have no right to interfere with our way of life.
Right. It was
almost the same words.
It's the same, right, because it is the same group. They have a group think about themselves. They need to protect themselves and their way of life. And although it's parasitic from our terms, our point of view, they may not see it that way at all. So, again, I personally don't think that the God that created this universe and us actually created them as well. I think they were created external some other manifestation. Yes, it's being allowed to happen. I do see where the Creator, our God of this universe, is allowing this to happen, but only up to a point. The infection is not going to completely take over the universe and just mess up everything that was created here. I don't think that's going to be permitted at all. In fact, I think we're coming up to in other words, there's a tipping point, and I do think that this situation is going to be resolved. And I'm pretty sure that's why they're a little nervous right now. These entities, whatever you want to call them, archons, demons, shadow people, it doesn't matter to me. The point is, we stand in opposition to them. I don't really wish them harm per se. I just want them to stop. Whatever rights they think they have, I don't agree with it at all. I don't think that they have any right to manipulate and control and damage other life forms. I just don't think that's. To my understanding, that is a violation of free will, and it's not part of God's law. At least my understanding of the the laws of this universe. So anyway,
I think the first thing is to realize that these things do exist.
Yeah, that's right.
They have told patients, when they ask them, who are you? They'd say, well, we're you. We're your thoughts.
No.
And the patient kind of going, well, what? And they will ask me, how do I tell them apart from my own thoughts? And I say, by the intent.
Right.
Was it your intent to get thrown in prison? Was it your intent to murder this guy? Was it your intent to use cocaine? Was it your intent to lose your job? Was it your intent to and they'll go, no, that wasn't my intention. And then the question becomes, well then, whose is it?
Yes, Dr. J, you bring up a fabulous point. I'm glad you did this. We need to discern between the voices that we hear. Is it ours or is it external? And some of the external voices that we hear actually are benevolent. Some of them are clearly malevolent. And in the Bible, I believe that this is what the quote was, is you would know them by their fruits.
Right.
This is how we discern them. Is the intent, as you said, was the intent benevolent towards you, or is it malevolent? Because they're so deceptive. That's how they absolutely have an upper hand on us, is through deceit and manipulation and lies and obfuscation. So it's really incumbent upon us, and I'm pretty sure that's why we've been having this conversation, is to encourage people to discern very carefully the voices that one hears in one's mind. What is the intent?
Well, yeah, that's probably the main thing, because the negative ones sound just like your regular thoughts.
They can.
They don't sound any different than your regular thoughts. It's like you think and you have the same. No, there's no change in tone. There's no change in amplitude. It comes through like a regular thought. You just have to be careful to watch. My original question that I asked that professor years ago: where do thoughts come from?
Right.
They are being put in your head, and they are trying to get you to act on them. And that's what these voices do with the schizophrenics. They put those thoughts in their head. Right. They say, this guy's going to beat you up. You better get him first. They can't make you act on them.
Right.
But they can keep at it, and keep putting that in there and putting it. Those thoughts come from other places. They don't all come from you.
Well, let's okay, in a biblical terms, Eve was, come on, we know a snake doesn't speak, right? And yet Eve was hearing a voice coming from a serpent, telling her to do something that was clearly evil intent. It was a violation. Although she had been warned not to do it, okay, the voice coming from a snake, which we know can't speak, the voice that she heard was causing her to consider doing something that was a violation and ignoring the consequences, right?
Right.
Okay.
They'll tell you, "Oh, that's okay. That's okay. That's fine." And they'll take whatever negative thing happens and they will blow it up way out of proportion.
Right.
And generate that negative emotional energy that they feed off of. And again, I need to make it real clear: it's not just happening to schizophrenics.
Right.
It's happening to all of us all the time.
Right. It's just a matter of degree, Doctor, and I agree. That's a good point.
It's just a matter of degree.
Yeah, that's really the point we need to make. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing? Because I do need to wrap the show up.
Yeah, one real quick one. A good friend of mine, Sherry, she was hearing voices, and I knew her for like 10 years before she admitted that to me. And she had got rid of them on her own without drugs, and she came up with a very useful program that is very simple, but it works. And she calls it "That's a Lie" program. So when you come up with a negative voice coming in your head saying da 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 da, she would go, "That's a lie. That's a lie," because they don't tell the truth. They lie constantly, and that would take the wind out of each individual thought that was hitting. And I tell that to patients, and that is a very useful thing in fighting off the voices. That's a lie. That's a lie. So what I found fascinating about our relationship is I'm looking at this from the outside in. Yeah. And she has been there. Yeah. And worked her way out of it on her own. And when I found something, I would call her and I would say, hey man, what do you think of this? So working together, we have an inside-outside, view of these things. And we've been writing about it. One of these days, the rate I'm going, it might be 100 years, but one of these days we'll get a book out. But we've been working on it. It's a ways off. But it's neat to bounce these ideas off of her and say, well, this is what I'm seeing. How did you experience this? Because she experienced it. Right. She was there, and she came out of it in much better shape than that lady who wrote that book, The Center Cannot Hold. And Sherry's done with these things. She's not taken any medicine. She never had. She got out of there on her own, without psychiatry, without medicines, without these toxic substances, which is really and she became a very successful civil engineer. Right. It's not like she's just a bumpkin secretary or something. She's very intelligent, very sharp, very organized. She has traveled the longest psychological distance of anybody I know, coming from hearing voices to becoming a very successful, nationally renowned engineer. Right. She just never ceases to amaze me.
Right. So there's a success story. Obviously, there's hope for all of us to deal with this. I think ultimately, on a higher level, though, there are higher beings that are fighting the good fight for us. However, as far as liberating this planet, oddly enough, the conversation we're having now, we have no idea how many people are going to hear it and ultimately share that information with their circle of friends and family. But I do think there's a tipping point. At some point in the future, enough of the humans here are going to recognize the true enemy. And at that point, not only will they do whatever they can to free themselves, but many people of faith are going to look to the heavens and say to the angelic kingdom, help us, please. And here's why I'm mentioning this, Doctor, is because until the time we do that, they really, in my understanding of this dynamic, is that they cannot just simply intervene. Okay?
No, you're right. They cannot interfere.
They
have
but
to
if we
sit
ask,
there and watch these. You have to ask.
Yes.
If you don't, everybody's got at least 2 guardian angels watching over them all the time. The more responsibility you have, the more you have. Yeah. But if you do not ask them for help, they cannot help you. Correct. They have to sit there and watch you get your butt kicked because they are not allowed to interfere without your permission. These dark ones can go right there. Right. Matter of fact, there was I think I wrote you about this, a lady who attempted suicide here. She drove her car in front of a train, 2 train. Matter of fact, she got hit head-on by one train moving in one direction. It just cut her car in half, threw her into the other track where another train was coming in the other direction. And that hit her too. Her car was completely decimated. They had to cut her out of that thing. Right. And here she was sitting in front of me. She had a black eye and a bloody nose after being hit by 2 trains. It was just a miracle, and I'm like, I was real curious. I asked her. I said, what did you experience after, being hit by 2 trains? What did you think? What was going through your head? Yeah. And she said, I was furious that I wasn't dead. Wow. She really wanted to die. She said, I was absolutely furious I wasn't dead. And she was trapped in the wreckage. She didn't get out. Then she said she heard her name called. And this was well before anybody could get to her. Very clearly, she heard her name called. Then she said she felt hands all over her body cradling her. Whoa. Like 20 sets of hands just cradling her and comforting her. and she said, they lasted for about a week, and they would disappear one by one as she became less angry about being alive. And she said she could feel the heat dissipate. When she took her hand, a hand disappeared, she could feel where the heat would dissipate from that hand. And she said, those were my guardian angels. She left a 17-year-old son on his own to kill herself, and it just wasn't her time to die.
Well, you're describing. Okay, this is really important. At times, they will intervene even without us asking, because we are leaving something totally unfinished.
As a last resort.
Yes, it's right. It's
an absolute.
That's only in
resort.
extreme cases. You're right, but it does happen. But
oh yeah.
But anyway, Okay, we have to stop at some point. I look forward to having you back on again. We'll continue this conversation at another time, because I do think it's highly important, and I also know that there's probably going to be a lot of people giving us questions and feedback in the future, so we can address that at another time.
Yes, I'll
fair
work
enough?
with you on that. Your show is very important, because you're getting that information that nobody else is. So I'll help you 100%.
All right. Thank you, Dr. J. You have a great day.
All right.
Thanks
All right,
again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Wow. Okay. That was wild. I hope that you enjoyed that show and learned something from it, folks. I know I did. And I know I am, I should say. I'm still learning as I go along with this. It isn't just a technical thing. There's a lot going on here, and I really do appreciate you listening to this show and supporting in any way you can. I do see that the future is bright. It's beyond even our wildest dreams what lays ahead. But there is some work that needs to be done here and now. And that's what we were discussing today. And if you found it helpful, if you found the show helpful, please pass the link on for the archive of this show to a friend or a family member so that they can benefit from it as well. And until next time, God bless.